I was staying in a cabin on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland in the mountains. One day we were snowed in, and when you're snowed up in there, you're stuck basically. Now, there are plenty of bears and deer up there. We kept salt licks, corn, and all kinds of stuff around. Not to hunt, but just to feed them. Well, I walk by the back window, which is over the underground garage, where we kept the snowmobiles and four-wheelers. I see this big brownish thing in the woods, probably 50 feet from the cabin, just sitting in the snow. I was shocked because I had never really seen a bear there, but heard the stories about them being around. So I ran to get my mom to show her, and as we walked back to the window, the damn thing stood up. And I don't mean like a bear. I mean like a big, tall man standing up. It then turned around and walked with a huge stride, and basically took off into the woods. We stood there shocked. What the hell was that? And my uncle just says, "Oh, that's a squatch. He's a celebrity around here." I don't know if he was just trying to make us feel better by diffusing the situation with a comedic remark, but after that I never went to those woods alone again. That's my encounter. The woods by where my father grew up have an old abandoned house, houses, I should say, scattered throughout the woods. I'm from the Hudson Valley. Anyone from that area knows the woods there have old houses, or at least the foundations remaining. Anyway, when my father was younger, he and everyone else basically would climb up this mountain to an abandoned house. He said it had an old black and white nudes, but a lot of kids would go up to smoke and hang out, so a lot of the things were just smashed. Part of the trip up the mountain basically involved climbing up a cliff, blanking on proper term, just a flat rock surface that you had to scale. This was also his usual way down, so one night he went up alone and was working his way down. Night was settling in, and as he was lowering himself down, the drop-off he felt had an odd presence and glanced upwards towards where he was just standing. Basically, what he saw was a quick glance because whatever it was just made him climb down the mountain and run home. He described it as basically very tall, lumbering above him and covered in hair. It wasn't a bear, at least from the glance he got. Normally, you'd take things to your parents and tell you have some doubt, but after a recent trip to his mother's and her sharing some of his stories that he told, it just made it more believable. There's also that whole you'll see what you want to see, so who knows. I'm terrified of heavily wooded areas, to be honest. I was on a 4-day canoeing trip with friends in a remote part of the southeast United States back when I was a young teen. We were up late, built a bonfire, and goofed off as young boys do. I'm sure we were making a lot of noise. Eventually the fire died down to just coals, and we just sat around it talking when we heard a distant, high-pitched scream. It freaked us out for a little bit, but eventually we forgot about it and went back to talking. A while later, one of my friends pointed to the opposite bank of the river and says, "Guys, what is that?" We looked, and standing there in the trees was a huge silhouette of some figure watching us. It was faint, but it was illuminated by the full moon, and it was huge. We just kind of stared at it in shock for a moment before backing away. We went to get our friend's dad and some flashlights. He was intent on showing us that nothing was there. We got back to the spot and it was still there, so we shined our flashlights on it, but it wasn't enough to get a better look. But the thing's eyes shone red with the reflection of our flashlights. We watched it watching us for a bit, and it walked up along an embankment, and then walked back and disappeared into the woods. That was more than a decade ago, and we rarely talk about it. We were all pretty freaked out. Finally, a chance for me to tell my story. About 10 years ago, my family and I were up in the White Mountains of Arizona to cut down our Christmas tree. My dad was driving our truck with my grandfather in the front seat, and my mom and sister in the back seat. I was in the bed of the truck, along with our family's German short-haired pointer. We were driving along a forest road, and all of a sudden, my dog starts barking and growling. So I look to see what it is, thinking it is maybe a bear or mountain lion. What I saw was a tall, dark figure walking parallel to the road just about 60 to 70 yards away. I yelled at my dad to stop the truck. When I told him I think I see Bigfoot, he just laughed and continued to drive. When I looked back to get another look at it, the figure had changed directions and was walking away from the road. The last thing I saw was the thing's head disappearing down a hill. To this day, I still do not have an explanation for what I saw, and every time the situation comes up, my dad always makes me tell everyone my story just so he could laugh. Didn't see anything, but heard. I lived in rural Massachusetts. To anyone who's familiar, that means miles of woodland with spaced out suburban areas in between. I was walking down my grandfather's logging trail, getting ready for his funeral. I'm also an avid mushroom collector, so I'm always walking slowly and staring at the ground. Friends hate me, basically. So I get to this cool little white-capped mushroom and stop to take a close-up picture of it. And that's when I heard it. The best way I can describe it is as if somebody with a lot of flesh on his knuckles were punching a tree. Now, I know what a deer sounds like when they stomp to protect their children and are smashing their antlers on trees. I've heard bear, fisher cat, moose, pretty much any animal in the western Massachusetts that exists. So, naturally, I looked up and freaked the hell out. It was so rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. It went on for minutes at the same pace. So, being the curious person that I am, I let out a whistle that couldn't be mistaken for a bird. Right after my whistle, I hear a low, quick whistle back. My first thought is, oh, it must be some asshole logger scooping the land past the no trespassing gate. Ignorant, I know. So I yell out, "Hello?" pretty much as loudly as I could. Then, whatever it was, ran away faster than I've ever heard a human being run. And using my experience with deer, dogs, moose, and bear, I just assessed that I couldn't possibly rationalize it being a four-legged creature. I know that what they sound like running, and this was much closer to a two-legged creature. I'm 100% positive on that. What doesn't make sense, however, is that the two-legged creature that ran away from me, faster than any two-legged creature I have ever heard before, also sounded like it was at a minimum 250 pounds. The steps were loud and very frantic. A lot of people believe Bigfoot has a spiritual connection to the forest it remains in, and thus the creatures in it as well. I do not find it a coincidence that this happened the day of my grandfather's funeral. I ran all the way home, and I have never looked back. Okay, so I have a story that happened to me and my friends. To set the scene, we were on a Boy Scout camping shooting trip. There were 20 to 30 of us. We were in a little cabin thing with windows on the front and back, and a front and back door. There were wooden tables all around the area. The adult cabin was about an eighth of a mile down a gravel road in the dark. There was obviously a buddy system because it's Boy Scouts. So, it's around midnight and everyone had been telling scary stories, just like a normal camping trip. Well, I had to go to the bathroom and asked my friend to come along. He said sure, and he got our knives. We knew that there were bears in the woods and it made us feel safer. Well, we went to the bathroom and began our walk back. This is where it got scary. I felt an instinctual fear. I looked to my friend and he had the same look as me. We began to walk just a little bit faster and unfold our pocket knives. I then turn around and see it. It looked similar to a cat, but it was roughly 6 feet tall and was on its hind legs, kinda hunched over. I freaked the hell out and started running. My friend sees it too and we sprint back to the cabin. It began making a moaning, howling noise and followed us very closely. We pound on the door and the guys let us in. We tell them what we saw and they actually believed us. So we locked the front door and looked at the back door. It had no lock. We pushed a table up against it and had a kid there with his knife for safety. We draw the blinds on all the windows that had them. One of them didn't, and we sat there with all the lights on. Then we see the eyes outside of the windows without blinds. We are all shitting ourselves, and the thing slowly walked to the back door. We heard it bumping up against it, maybe trying to open it, we think. It then left, but we still thought we were going to die. No one slept that night. And when the adults came to wake us up, we told them, and they just laughed and said we were making it up. We know it happened, even if they didn't believe us. Not me, but my cousin. In the 80s, my cousin was on a camping trip with his wife. It wasn't a busy day for camping, and according to my cousin, the ranger told them that they were the only ones camping there that night. Anyway, so it's getting late, and my cousin said he spots something across the lake. He thought it was a bear standing, so he grabs his binoculars. It was sort of like a bear, but it was standing up on its hind legs. He said it wasn't a bear because it had a face, like a 70-year-old man, and the fur was longer than a bear. He thought maybe it was someone in a suit, but it disappeared quickly, whatever it was. He was so spooked and wanted to leave the park immediately. His wife thought he was being ridiculous, though, and just having an overactive imagination. She had brought a shotgun and insisted that they be fine if anything happened. Anyway, so that night everything is going fine until my cousin is awakened by footsteps. Now, his wife is still asleep at this point, but he doesn't want to wake her. He just tries to keep as still and quiet as possible. A figure approaches the tent. My cousin said he was positioned so that his head was on the corner of the tent. This figure leans down and gently presses its hand around the corner of the tent. So the figure is basically putting its hands around my cousin's head. I don't remember how long he said this lasted, but this figure eventually left. My cousin said it smelled like mechanical things, like someone working on a car, although he heard no car. Next morning, everything at the campsite was untouched. No problems at all. My cousin didn't mention anything about finding footprints. There wasn't any evidence that someone had been there. He eventually went and researched the area and discovered that their camping area is supposedly a hot spot for Bigfoots and such. He firmly believes that he saw some kind of sasquatch. I'm not sure if I believe him. If anything, I always thought it was just a person messing with him. I actually have several other stories, but I didn't want to post to drag on, and I thought it would be too overwhelming. What convinced me was I saw it happen, and my cousin saw it with me. We were cruising through some rural areas in my cousin's car, and I want to say it was about 1 or 2 a.m. We weren't smoking or drinking, but just having a nice cruise. We went on this road that went through some heavy woods, but we did it before, so we had no fear. It was dark, of course, no moon, with just a slight sprinkle of rain. We were coming to this part in the woods where there was a street light, but it was an old light and was starting to dim out. There used to be an old building there, but was torn down, but the light stayed up for a few years. Mind you, this was very rural, and no one lived nearby for maybe 20 miles, so it was extremely rare for you to pass another car, let alone another person at this time. It didn't help that the locals said, stay out of the woods at night. I was just looking out my window at the woods, and when we were coming up to the light, next thing I know, the car does a movie turn, like stomp on the brakes, do a 180, and freaking burn rubber the other way. I get weirded out and look back through the car, and I see the road illuminated by the streetlight, and I see this massive black figure beside the road. It takes one step, and it's in the middle of the road. Another step, and it's already on the other side. Immediately, I look forward, scared out of my mind, and look at my cousin, and I see the intense fear on his face. We don't say a word to each other, and he drops me off. I stay up till sunrise and finally go to sleep. Funny now that I think about it, we never talked about once, not after it happened, but yeah, we saw Bigfoot, and the locals do tell very similar stories. Last October, I was in California for roughly 11 days after my brother's wedding in San Diego. I just wanted to drive around the state and visit California places that had captured my imagination over the years, and I love driving almost as much as I love cars. I don't necessarily believe in Sasquatch, but I would never discount someone else's experience, especially if I wasn't there, so off I went. Clipper Mills is in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, about 70 miles northeast of Sacramento. Very near that dam was in the danger of failing last year. Pretty remote. So, after Bodega Bay, I head across the state for my destination, arriving near Sacramento in time for a late dinner. So it's after dark when I set out on the final leg. Very dark. It takes me a good while on all the twisty turning roads to find my way there. I wanted to get to the exact spot the person who posted the video parked that night. He wouldn't say in his video, so I poked around YouTube comment sections and related videos and found out more or less about the spot. Around 11 p.m., I pulled my rented Camry well off the dark 2-lane road to avoid any issues with the very sparse traffic. I saw no one whatsoever, so I sat in the darkened interior, listening, allowing my eyes to dark adapt for about 20 minutes. I heard nothing but assorted insects as I sat there. Saw nothing move at all. Eventually, not wanting to activate the car's interior lighting, I crawled out of the driver's side window into the black night, armed with my cell, with no service, a handheld GPS to find my way back should I get lost in the dark, and a red flashlight I use with my telescope. I stand there right by that car window for a solid 2 minutes before I could screw up the courage to move away from my Camry. Eventually, I walk up the road, still not hearing anything but bugs. Suddenly, without conscious decision to do so, I veer right and head up into the woods. My feet are crunching pine needles now, and to my mind, I sound like Bigfoot stomping around myself. After what was about 20 minutes, I stopped to listen and added to the insects I hear, this faint screeching sound far off in the blackness. And it doesn't sound insect-like at all. It has more consciousness to it. The now also thoroughly dark adapted mind is whispering that it sounds like a person in distress, or a large primate. I remain still. I hear something small scurrying around in the underbrush as well, followed a minute later by that same forlorn-sounding wail, but now closer. Time to return to the car. As I'm walking back to the car, I hear this spooky sound, every 20 to 30 seconds, and now it is coming from behind me and in front of me. Shit. It seems to have a vocabulary of some sort to me now. Different vocalizations, some guttural, some high-pitched, and everywhere in between. My mind is having fun, just messing with me now. I was never so happy to see a Camry in all my life. I started it up before my ass was in the seat, I think, and half expected to see scores of red eyeballs glowing at me in the headlights from the dark forest in front of me. Now spooked, and my mind telling me some homicidal axe-wielding lunatic was nipping at my heels. I went back the way I came at much quicker pace than I had arrived. Out of nowhere, right in front of me, this black lab runs out of the woods on one side of the road and into the woods on the other. I barely missed crushing him. That scared the shit out of me right there. I slowed down a bit, and the thought of nearly mowing down an innocent mutt overcoming my mind. Some hour down the road towards Sacramento is when I noticed I had cell service again. I opened my Expedia app and found a nearby hotel for the night. Once safely enclosed in said hotel room, I began scouring the internet on my iPad and came to the conclusion that what I heard was a barred owl or a western screech owl. Can never be 100% sure, I suppose. Very creepy though, and I'm done with wandering alone in the woods at night. I think.
Are you ready for a bedtime story?
This story isn't mine, it's actually my dad's. Every other summer, him and a few of his friends go over to Maine and do some bass fishing. The encounter happened at around 2 to 3 in the morning. My dad got out of his tent because he had to take a piss. As he was draining himself, he heard a snap about 25 feet away. He looked up and saw nothing. To make sure it wasn't a predator, he shone his flashlight over in the general direction. The woods were really thick, so he really didn't see much at all, except for a pair of eyes. He really couldn't tell how high up off the ground they were, so, being the person he is, walked towards it, and as he did so, whatever the thing was ran away, and my dad got a better look at it. He says that it was around 8 feet and smelt pretty bad, like trash. He told his friends the next day, but they decided to stay the rest of the week due to the fact that my dad didn't feel that the Bigfoot wanted to hurt them, but was just more curious. He came home and told me, and now, a few years later, I'm telling you. I really hope that one day I could see what he saw so I can fully believe that this world is actually a strange one. I have had a lot of paranormal encounters, but this is not my story, this is my mother's. My mom and my uncle had to go pick up my grandmother. She worked in a small town called Red River, and the blizzard was so bad that my grandmother's car wasn't turning on. So she told my mom to pick her up and be safe because the roads were very slippery. My mom told my uncle to go with her, and they were at the Cuesta, New Mexico, and they drove slowly because the storm was so bad. While driving, a large creature started walking across the road. It was about 9 feet tall, and the creature had white fur and large teeth, and it just stared at my mother and uncle, and then it turned away and ran to the woods. They started talking about it, that they both agreed that it was a Bigfoot the next day, and my uncle went to the area. He found footprints and even took a picture of it. In the mountains of New Mexico, creepy stuff happens every day. It was the summer of 2015, and I was in 12th grade. Me and 2 other friends went on the camping trip in Alberta, Canada. The drive up was normal. We got to the campsite, and oh yeah, one of my friends, who we will call Jeff, brought his girlfriend, who we will call Jane. So when we pulled up to our camp spot, we unloaded our gear, then had lunch, and then we went on for a hike around 3 o'clock. We came back around 5:15. And for about 4 hours, we sat around the campfire telling stupid stories and other stuff like that. But this is when shit gets too real. We started to get the feeling we were being watched, which is weird because there was no one around us for about a whole kilometer. So we thought it just might be a fellow camper, so I yelled out, "Hey!" But no response. So we just ignored it. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of snapping twigs. I looked out of the tent curiously, and what I saw was a creature. About 20 meters away from the tent, it was about 8 feet tall with nut brown hair, and that's all I could really see in the moonlight. So I woke up my friend, and he went pale. He slowly closed the tent zipper and looked at me and said, "It's right outside." I told him that's impossible because it was just 20 meters away. To start out, my name is Doug, and my father and I are what you would call avid hunters, and we know what is in the woods where we hunt. Well, we took a trip to West Virginia to go black bear hunting. I was back at camp resting from an early morning bear hunt, and my father went out to go hunting for the afternoon, and I knew where he would be in case of emergence. Well, he gets to his spot and stays there till the sun sets, and then he starts to head back to the side-by-side he took out to get to his spot. On his way back, he heard footsteps, and remember, this is in the mountains where only hunters and rare locals know where they're at. The footsteps he heard were nothing human or bear, and he stopped for a second and kept walking, and then the most blood-curdling yet powerful yell came behind him, and he thought, so this is how it ends. Well, it will be a hell of a race. If he gets to the side-by-side, and as soon as he got in, something came running up at him and threw a giant rock at him. My father came back to the camp where I was waiting for him, and that was the first time I ever saw my father scared, He didn't come out of the camper till it was time to leave, and we left with no further incident whenever we return. Let me start off with a few disclaimers. This isn't my story, it's a friend of my grandfather, and it's been a few years since I was told it, so the memory might be a bit hazy, and it may not be scary to most people, but I thought I would share it anyway. Also, if there are any mistakes in the story, I apologize. At the time of writing this, I was getting over a concussion. This story happened in Upstate New York. My grandfather's friend was hunting with one other person. For privacy reasons, I won't use any names of the people in this story. Anyway, they came across a road and decided to split up going in opposite directions on the road. He perched himself on a rock and waited till about 4 in the afternoon, but nothing showed. At this time, he decided to meet up with his friend. Right when he got off the rock he was sitting on, he saw something walking in the woods across a clearing not far from him. The thing walked out of the trees, and it had its right side facing him. He didn't know if it was a bear or a person, and he didn't know whether to talk to it or not. He then decided to whistle at it. The thing walked away from him on 2 legs, back into the forest. It disappeared from his sight. It then walked back out of the forest, this time facing him. They stared at each other before the thing walks back into the woods again and out of sight. My grandfather's friend walked back down the road away from the thing he saw, where he saw his friend walking up to him. He asked him if he had been down where he saw the creature. He said he never went down that way. To this day, he insists that it wasn't a bear because it would have stumbled on 2 legs, and he swears it wasn't a person because they would have alerted him of their presence. He insists that it was a Bigfoot. And this is coming from a second-hand source, so you can judge on whether or not it's true, but I hope to find what he saw. What I'm about to tell you is very true. I've never told anyone in my life till now. This happened to me back in 2003 at our family farm in Ohio. It was mid-October, and my dad and I were on our way to the farm to deer hunt, as we always did every weekend. We arrived there around 5:45 in the morning. We sat in the truck talking and joking about who was going to see more deer or shoot the bigger buck like always. At about 5 till 6, we got out and got our gear on and headed towards the woods. As we entered the woods on the left side of the cow pasture, I noticed an odd, eerie feeling, which was normal for me, I guess, as the woods always gave me that feeling, even since I was young. My dad walked me to my tree stand and made sure I got in and situated safely. He told me good luck, as always, and I said I'll be back at noon. He then proceeded to his stand a few minutes after he left. This overwhelmingly tingle came over my body, as if someone or something was watching me. At this time, it was still dark. I began to look around the surrounding timber, trying to make out silhouettes, but couldn't. I was beginning to become very overwhelmed with that feeling of eyes upon me. A few minutes have passed since I scanned the timber last. I tried once more since my eyes have now adjusted to the dark better. I look off to my left and then slowly towards my right again, and nothing. I try to calm myself and mentally say, "It's nothing, you're fine." All of a sudden, I hear a crashing coming towards me from the left, and my heart sinks as I look. It was a few deer running for what appeared to be for their life. They blow through the woods and don't stop as I hear them still crashing through the timber. At this time, I am only able to make out silhouettes and outlines of trees. I thought that it was odd, but maybe a coyote or something was after them and just shrugged it off. Maybe 5 minutes later, it's still dark, but dawn approaches. I then feel the hair on my neck stand up, and that eerie feeling comes back upon me. My heart starts to pound profusely. I hear heavy crunching of leaves and loud snaps of sticks from the direction the deer had ran from, which was the neighbor's property. On the left side of our woods is 100 plus acres of switchgrass and hundreds of acres of other woods. I look up and see what appears to be my dad walking towards me. Daylight is starting to break now, but it's still pretty dark inside the woods. I wait till what I thought was my dad got about 20 yards plus from me, and I quietly say, "What are you doing, Dad?" No response. It just continues to walk towards me. So I say a little louder, "Dad, what are you doing?" And still no response. I begin to say, "Hey, you know you're trespassing, buddy." But no response. And as it got to the tree that my deer stand was in, I noticed that it was not my dad. I begin to freak out. I look across the woods to where my dad's tree stand is, and I see his flashlight climbing up the tree. And that's when I look down and seen this thing standing directly underneath my tree stand, looking dead at me. Whatever it was tall enough to reach up and grab my foot with ease. Mind you, I'm 14 feet up this tree. I began to start crying from fear, and my heart was beating so hard and fast I thought it was going to explode out of my chest. I let out a wimpy, muffled, yell. It just grumbled at me and walked off following the direction of the deer. I watched it disappear into the timber as the darkness was fading fast. Once it was gone, I was overwhelmed with this god-awful smell of body odor, mixed with the smell of death, old hound dog, and trash. As the morning went on, the woods was dead silent. Not a bird, squirrel, or deer, nothing. I've never heard the woods that quiet before, ever. Once I calmed down enough to climb down and out of my tree, I ran to my dad and told him I wanted to leave now, that I didn't feel well, so we left. This happened to me when I was 15. I'm now 29 and I've never hunted our woods in the morning again. I will not be there after dark to this day, and I still have not told anyone till now. I do not smoke, drink, or do drugs. Never have I promised. This is a 100% true story and the scariest thing that's ever happened.